I'm sure most all of you are familiar with Dr. John Coski. Dr. Coski is historian at what was the Museum of the Confederacy and now the American Civil War Museum. He has worked there since 1988, so more than 30 years. He has a BA degree from Mary Washington College and an MA and PhD from College of William and Mary. He's worked for the National Park Service. Excuse me. He's also the author of several books, most notably, as Patrick mentioned, The Confederate Battle Flag, America's Most Embattled Emblem, which was a very important book when it came out, and also Capital Navy, The Men, Ships, and Operations of the James Brewer Squadron. He's also published numerous essays, articles, and reviews. He's given more than 250 public talks, conference papers, and so on. He's recently begun research towards what he hopes to be a book-length history of Belle Isle, tentatively entitled Belle Isle, Life and Death, Past and Present on America's Founding River, which of course deals with not just with the prison camp at Belle Isle, but also with the history of Belle Isle throughout Richmond's history. And his talk today is how Civil War prisons help us better understand pretty much everything about the Civil War. So Dr. John Coski.
And good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I have the microphone here. Okay, very good. And David mentioned earlier about the museums symposium on February 27th. Everybody's doing advertisements these days. You have to sit through 15 minutes of advertisements before you watch a movie nowadays, so you'll forgive me for giving a little bit of an ad for that symposium. Ours is not free. It requires, reservations are encouraged. It does include a lunch for your $40 membership fee if you're a member, $65 if you're not. It's Saturday, February 22nd at the Library of Virginia in downtown Richmond. Some familiar faces from today, including, we hope, Gary Gallagher. Hope his back is better. And John White. And speaking on topics different than what you'll be hearing today. Some of you I know are regulars, and I hope the rest of you will become regulars for our annual symposium as well. Well, one of the credentials that I'd never put in my brief bio, that I'll mention now, is former past president of the Richmond Civil War Roundtable, and one reason I don't is that there are so many of them around, there's about half a dozen of them here today, that it's not exactly a special, unique honor, but you know, if you're not a former president of the Civil War Roundtable, stand up. But anyway, so some of my homeboys over here, I want to acknowledge them in an indirect way as well. Now, I will confess to a wee bit of hyperbole in my title of my talk this morning, but having organized a lot of these talks myself, I know that it's all about marketing sizzle, so you have to have a good name. And when you're talking about prisons first thing in the morning, you have to get, and you have John White and Gary and Liz and Trevor Plant following you, you have to give people a reason to show up on time. So my title, a bit of an exaggeration, but maybe not. The concept for this talk began in conversations between Patrick and myself. He asked me what I wanted to do. I deferred to him, sent him my Vita, and asked him to choose from my so-called repertoire. And he asked me to do either Belle Isle or maybe something he saw about Civil War art, art of the Confederacy that I've done in the past. But I thought the former, I've done it too many times too recently, and some of you have already seen it, or some version of it, so I declined on that basis. The other has been so long, and also the Civil War art tends to be kind of a show and tell, not serious enough. I wanted something a little more serious and scholarly. So I told Patrick that I could come up with something that was maybe a little more significant and marries the topics in some way, makes it both of merit, of scholarly merit, and is new and interesting to all of you. After a bit of thought, I came up with this topic, and I thought it might be pretty interesting and maybe even pretty important. As I started working on the details, I thought, what was I thinking? I wish I could say that I had come up with it under the influence of alcohol or maybe strong cold medicine, but I was sober and I was well when I did. So you're my guinea pigs. You'll have the opportunity to tell me whether there's something to this topic, or, kind of to paraphrase what Gertrude Stein said of my natal city, Oakland, California, is there no there here. So let me give you a little bit of background about how I came to this topic. You're looking at Belle Isle, by the way, here, just as my beginning slide. Let me see, does it go this way or this way? It goes this way. Good, okay. Early in my career at the Museum of the Confederacy, I had to write a lot of labels for a couple of displays of Civil War prison art. We have a fabulous collection of this stuff. And, oops, okay, so it is that way. Okay. This is great stuff. It shows what men can do when they have lots of time on their hands. And it's hard not to love this stuff. So I really became fascinated in this miniature furniture and some of the jack straws and some of the tools that men used to make this POW art. So it's one of my first exposures to this whole topic as a historian at the Museum of the Confederacy. And it's not just interesting as artifacts, it's pretty significant too. It was part of the thriving prison economy and the black market that thrived at many prison camps, as Michael Gray has written about the Elmira prison and the prison economy and the role of these gewgaws and doodads made of gutta percha and wood in the prison camp economy. Not only a black market that existed between prisoners, prison guards, and the wider communities outside the gates of the prisons. When I became director of the library, the Eleanor S. Brockenbrough Library at the museum in 1996, I became very familiar with this fabulous collection we have of Civil War autograph books, such as this one that belonged to a man named George McKnight, better known as Asa Hartz. He was a poet and wag who wrote in a lot of other men's books at Johnson's Island camp for Confederate officers. You know, a lot of artworks in these, let's go this way, there you go. In these prison old war autograph books, some of them wonderful, like this one by Kennedy Palmer of the 13th Virginia Infantry, just real works of art in these artwork, in these prisoner war autograph books. And this one, a drawing of Johnson's Island Prison. And we had a lot of letters from prisoners to women in the North who served as pen pals and furnished the men with clothing and food that they weren't getting in prison. So it's a fabulous collection that with which I became familiar as an archivist and serving it to other researchers. And I did a lot of work on this on my own as one of my first priorities on these letters and these diaries. And you see, Patrick, how I'm getting Civil War art into this after all. So I'm kind of sneaking it in through the back door. And we shared a lot of this work with our members through our magazine and with the wider public, an article I did for North-South Traders Civil War. So as I say, I've been working on this stuff for a long time. We've been sharing it as well with scholars. Jay Gillespie on the right, his book, Andersonville to the North, took advantage of our collection, which, by the way, is mostly not about Confederate prison camps. We don't have records of Belle Isle or Confederate prison camps. It's mostly things relating to Confederate prisoners held in northern prison camps. So it really informed Jay's book on Civil War prison camps in the North. And the book on the left by Charles Sanders won our Jefferson Davis Prize in 2005. And I'll be leaning very heavily on it today. It's a good work about Civil War prisons. And all the while, I went to work every day, a bicycle commute, and have been doing so for 20-some years, across Belle Isle. But I never thought of it as a prison camp. It was just a cool way of getting to work. And my industrial ruins, as well as right through the middle of the site of a Civil War prison. And I did a little bit of work on it. I started, for 20 years I went over it and was completely clueless about it being a prison camp, or not clueless, but just didn't care, didn't think about it, until September of 2013 when I started working on this book project that David described. And I've done some talks about it in one article and a couple of things for Civil War Monitor. I hope to get back to it soon, someday, and if I don't, David Coles is going to finish the book that he wanted to write many years before I ever touched it, so I guess I better get going. And that's the way I have joined this small gaggle of historians who are working on the subject of Civil War prisons. You've noticed that historians are pack animals. We kind of move in little clouds of dust from one popular topic to another. I won't say that this is exactly a hot topic in the Civil War literature, but it's becoming so. In the book on the upper left, a new one about essays, a new book of essays, Crossing the Deadlines. It's kind of a digest of some of the emerging scholarship in Civil War historiography. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my time, now that I spent 10 minutes telling you why I started on this topic and how I got to this point, let me spend the rest of my time talking about trying to demonstrate to you how the study of Civil War prisons and prisoners helps us better understand larger important themes of Civil War history, and especially Civil War historiography. And I know I should never talk about historiography before noon, but it's nothing quite like historiography to get your blood moving in the morning. What most people know about prisons mostly is that you didn't want to be in one. That's the first thing you know. They were not and are not creditable in American history to either side in the Civil War. Most people know about Andersonville, and they know that it looms large over the prison field the way Gettysburg does over battlefields and battles in Civil War. And prisons are kind of an obligatory sidebar to almost every history of the Civil War. A sidebar that usually focuses on Andersonville and how the horrors of Andersonville and other camps were regrettable byproducts of circumstances beyond the control of the northern and southern authorities. Civil War prisons provide an insightful case to allow us to trace the arc of the changing nature of the war, to use Mark Grimsley's nomenclature, from the Rosewater policy of 1861 and 62 to the hard war of 1864 and 1865. And even if Jason Phillips has kind of poked the holes in the idea that of this notion that everyone was not prepared for a long war, that the myth of the short war, it was going to be a 90-day affair. That was it. Nobody prepared for it. Jason has kind of challenged that. But nonetheless, when you're talking about prison camps, it is striking at how unprepared both sides were to care for each other's prisoners. Like James Chestnut's boast that he would drink the blood, all the blood that was spilled in the Civil War that would fit in a lady's thimble, or the 90-day enlistments, Americans had a sort of a naive, wishful thinking about the war, that somehow it wouldn't prove to be cataclysmic. There wouldn't be much loss of life. It wouldn't be very disruptive to the nation as a whole. Indeed, during the first months of the war, it seemed like the nation might be able to get by without creating a large apparatus of prisons, and it wouldn't be a problem in caring for each other's prisoners, in large part because commanders on the field were making decisions about paroling on the spot many of the prisoners that they were taking. Yeah, this optimism that maybe we would be able to get by without having to create a prison system was dashed at First Bull Run, or Manassas, in July 1861, when 1,000 Union prisoners, including civilians, came into Southern hands. And as you know, the South housed those prisoners, not here at Libby, the most famous of the buildings in Richmond, but the Ligon Prison and other warehouses in downtown Richmond became the first Civil War prisons for those prisoners in from Manassas and elsewhere. But the number of prisoners taken soon outgrew the capacity of the Richmond building stock. And John Winder, who became kind of a de facto commandant of prisoners for the Confederacy, opened up a couple of others, including the Rowan County cotton factory in Salisbury, North Carolina, became the Salisbury Prison. So larger buildings further south along railroads, transportation lines. The U.S. government opened up forts, like Fort McHenry, good old Fort McHenry of Star-Spangled Banner fame, and forts in New York City, on the islands in New York City, Old Capitol in Washington, D.C., and Fort Warren here in Boston Harbor became some of the early prison sites for in the north. And Johnson's Island, that we saw earlier, became a kind of a prison depot, and later an officer's prison. Another complicating issue arose, and another one of these themes that I want to explore, arose with the federal capture of men from three privateering vessels of the Confederacy. So it raised the question, were these prisoners to be treated as prisoners, or were they pirates to be treated as pirates, which meant execution? And it brought up a transcendent legal and constitutional issue that bedeviled the Union and the Lincoln administration throughout the war. I'm not going to talk too much about legal and constitutional issues with John White anywhere nearby, because he knows so much more about it than I do. But it raised the issue, how could the Union deal with the Confederacy on issues of prisoners and prisons without recognizing the Confederacy? It maintained the fiction throughout the war that there was no Confederacy. It was simply a domestic insurrection. So it was a bit of a conundrum for the Lincoln administration. And as you know, you usually encounter this issue in terms of the blockade. the naval blockade on the southern coast. It's a blockade is what you do for a foreign power, not for a domestic insurrection. So did Lincoln make a mistake by declaring a blockade, and did that in effect recognize the Confederacy? Most scholars say no. But the Lincoln administration, with the privateer prisoners from Jeff Davis and Savannah and others, threatened to execute them. Well, the Confederates then draw lots from the prisoners living in prison, and designated a similar number of Union prisoners, including a direct descendant of Paul Revere, who would be executed if the Union executed Confederate prisoners. So both sides backed down in this crisis in late 1861, but it was not the last time that both sides threatened a policy based on retaliation and revenge. Now, and I mentioned this conundrum, is some of the correspondence regarding prisons noticed the use of the so-called Confederacy, which was the language that the Union used throughout the war in referring to the Confederate government, the so-called Confederacy. So this is this legal problem I was mentioning. Old brains, you know, Henry Halleck, considered one of the great authorities on Union military policy, offered a way out, or he was one of many who offered a way out, by saying that after full consideration of the subject, I am of the opinion that prisoners ought to be exchanged. The exchange is a mere military convention. In other words, treat it not as a convention between governments, but between opposing military forces, even if they're not formally recognized. So just as the Lincoln administration throughout the war had to talk about the so-called Confederacy and pretend the Confederacy didn't exist, they were able to get around this by treating with the military authorities. The problem became acute with the capture of Fort Donelson, Grant's capture of Fort Donelson in February of 1862. The fort and 16,000 prisoners. What to do with these guys? Well, instead of simply paroling them on the spot, they were sent to prisons, new prisons that were opened up at what had been federal military training camps for federal troops at Camp Douglas, Illinois, Chicago, most notably, and also Camp Morton in Indiana, and that's my button. Camp Chase should be coming out. Oh, there you go. Camp Chase, a little Grandma Moses kind of genre painting in our collection of Camp Chase. These were all formerly training camps for Union troops, now repurposed as prison camps to accommodate this huge number of prisoners from Fort Donelson and, in subsequent battles, Shiloh, the 7 Days, the 7 Pines, and 7 Days. It was the 7 Days and the prisoners from the 7 Days that really challenged Confederate capacity. And it's what accounted for the opening of Belle Isle very hurriedly, in late June, early July of 1862 to accommodate the prisoners from 7 Days. But what was really needed by both sides was some kind of exchange agreement. And that was negotiated among military commanders, John Dix on the left and Harvey Hill on the right. So the Dix-Hill cartel was negotiated successfully in July of 1862. And after what it involved was an agreement under which both sides would be obligated to release the other's prisoners within 10 days of their capture. Copy of it, by the way, from our collection. They would be taken to rendezvous points, one on the James River at Aiken's Landing and the other in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And the men would be paroled and they could not be, shall not be able to take up arms again or to discharge any duty usually performed by soldiers, including guard duty, which had been a sore point, until exchanged under the provisions of this cartel. And the exchange would be a one-for-one exchange for analogous rank, privates for privates, and the same ranks from naval prisoners. Or as many as 60 privates for one commanding general, 6 privates for a captain, 15 privates for a colonel, that kind of thing. So here's the exchange point at Aiken's Landing on the James River, downriver from Richmond. And each side was to furnish the other with a list of the men who had been paroled so they could keep track for even exchange. This cartel was immediately successful. The prison population from Belle Isle reduced from about 4,000 in the summer of '62 to 0 by September. And the number of prisoners that were held by the Union, by the North, went from 20,500 in July to about 1,286 in December. So the exchange cartel was a really hopeful sign that the nation could come up with a humane way of treating prisoners, humane in an expensive and efficient way, without having to to have the excesses of horrible modern war. This exchange cartel coincided with the U.S. government's effort to codify the so-called rules of war, accomplished mostly by the so-called Lieber Code of Prussian-born Francis Lieber. Columbia University was asked to come up with a code that was enacted in April of 1863 by the U.S. military. And as John Fabian Witt and other scholars have written, the Lieber Code addressed not only the obvious wartime issues that were endemic to war, but treatment of civilians and civilian property and things like treatment of prisoners, but also the emerging challenges of dealing with human property, contraband, African-American refugees, as the issue of emancipation and slavery and the end of slavery became more important and more disruptive to both sides. The Lieber Code was largely to address the rules and the conventions for dealing with African-Americans of the slaves and as soldiers. With the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, and the preliminary emancipation, that is, and the enlistment of African-American troops, which began, of course, as you know, in South Carolina and elsewhere before the Emancipation Proclamation, the question of how African-American troops, U.S. colored troops, were to be treated was a big part of the Lieber Code. And it is one of these central issues, particularly in today's study of the Civil War. And once again, it's related intimately to the question of prisoners of war and prison camps. What to do with African-American soldiers captured in battle. Okay, so here's some of the African-American troops of the 29th Connecticut at Beaufort, South Carolina. So the Emancipation Proclamation and the tentative and then wholesale recruitment of black troops had an enormous impact on the prison issue, and I'm sure Liz Barron will be talking about it at some length this afternoon. As you know, what the Confederate government, how the Confederate government reacted was to say that black soldiers would not be treated as prisoners. They were escaped slaves. They were insurrectionist slaves, and the white officers who commanded them were analogous to people who helped foment slave insurrection. And they would be treated under Southern state law as those crimes were treated, usually with execution, not exchange. And the Confederate government's threat to execute African-American troops and their commanders led, of course, to reprisals or to the threat of reprisals. And this went on in 1863, and was threatening to scuttle the exchange cartel that had been worked out a year earlier. The Lincoln administration threatened the execution of Southern prisoners if there were any African Americans executed, and the execution of officers, and putting officers to hard labor if Southern African American prisoners were put back into slavery, as they were threatened with. Both sides tried to work out some means to avoid the worst of this revenge policy. But in May 1863, the Lincoln administration issued a ruling, and the Army did too in July, that effectively ended the exchange cartel that had been negotiated a year earlier. There were some exceptions to that, but I won't go into all those details. Now, this sounds on the surface, of course, to be a rare example in which principle triumphed over everything. The United States government was standing up for the rights of its African-American troops by threatening reprisals and by ending the exchange cartel, rather than allowing these men to be languishing in prisons forever, or to be executed. But this was true, but it was not the whole truth. There were other reasons for the collapse of the exchange cartel in 1863. For one thing, some Confederate troops were gaming the system. They knew that if they were captured, they would be released within 10 days, return home, and would have an opportunity to go home before having to go into the ranks again. Some of them might be able to get out of that entirely. And this was particularly true of men who had accepted bounties, bounty jumpers. They could just get themselves captured, knowing that they were going to be released and sent home. So that was a system liable to abuse, as U.S. Grant and others understood. Vicksburg, the capture of 30,000 prisoners at Vicksburg, was something of a final straw. The Union government was suspicious that the Confederacy wasn't administering the exchange cartel as it should have been doing, that they were cheating on it a little bit. And in Vicksburg, what happened, 30,000 prisoners were captured and paroled, not sent to Union prison camps at all. They were sent to parole camps in Mississippi held by other Confederates. This was a fiasco. And it was embarrassing. The conditions in these camps were almost as bad as if these men had been held in the North. And these men were melting away. And finally, the Confederacy in September more or less declared them unilaterally exchanged. And the Union learned of this. And of course, this was a violation of the terms of the parole agreement, exchange agreement a year earlier. And this, as much as anything, helped discover the exchange cartel. This man, you know, Ben Butler, who was himself something of you're supposed to boo at this point when you see Butler's picture on the screen. He was himself kind of an obstacle to prisoner exchanges because of his misbehavior, the perceived misbehavior in New Orleans. The Confederacy had a price on his head, and for a while were threatening not to exchange prisoners until the Union government turned him over personally to Confederate authorities so he could be dealt with. But what the Union did is appoint him Commissioner of Exchange in early 1864 to negotiate the revival, they hoped, of the prison cartel exchange. Meanwhile, of course, in the winter of 1863-64, the prison situation grew much worse, and I'm going to deal with that in a moment. On April 1st, 1864, Butler met with his counterpart, with the new commander, not his counterpart, but the commander-in-chief of U.S. forces, U.S. Grant, to discuss the prison question. And this is what I meant earlier about that the African-American troop issue was part of the issue, but not all of the issue. In a conversation that Butler later recorded, and I'll show you excerpts of it in a moment, Grant explained to Butler that by the exchange of prisoners, we got no men to fit into our army, and every soldier we gave the Confederates went immediately into theirs, so that the exchange was virtually so much to aid them, and so much aid to them and none to us. We received from them substantially but disabled men, and by our laws and regulations, they were to be allowed to at once 3 months furlough and were taken to camps and allowed to go home to recuperate, which few of them did, and fewer still came back to our armies. So in Butler's book, published after the war, you can read along for yourself for some of this, that preparing for the spring campaign, what we know as the Overland Campaign. And Grant was concerned that basically if we resumed the prison exchanges, we're just putting men in their ranks, 26,000 men, a complete corps, larger than any of Lee's other corps. We're going to be just giving them free men, and the men that we get back in return are not fit to go into our army yet. And then he said at the beginning of this, while the great sufferings of our prisoners remaining in their hands was much to be regretted, yet being held gave use their equivalent in many more, because in their desperation the rebels would have no hesitation in putting, as they had done, their paroled prisoners before exchange was declared directly into their armies, which we had never done. He, Grant, was further inclined to think that if the exchanges were to cease, that fact would take away the great temptation of that class of our soldiers who were not Americans, or if Americans who had not enlisted voluntarily into our armies, or were induced to great bounties to do so, to surrender themselves, as I mentioned earlier, to escape. Secretary of War Stanton, I have him here, yes, and Lincoln endorsed this reasoning. They came up, however, with a propaganda strategy. It would not look good, of course, to say that we're not going to resume this exchange cartel because it works to the rebels' advantage more than it does to ours, that we can afford the manpower loss better than they can. So they agreed that the foot they wanted to put forward publicly was that regarding the exchange of African-American troops, that we are ceasing and the exchange cartel has become moribund because the rebels are refusing to treat African-American prisoners as prisoners. That was, in a sense, the cover story. It was true, but it was not the entire truth. The exchange cartel's collapse in the middle of 1863 was the most important thing that ever happened for the story of Civil War prison camps. It is what brought the suffering that we see here on Belle Isle in the winter of 1863-64. When the population of Belle Isle, which had been designated for about 3,000, shot up to as many as 9,500 during this unusually cold winter, very similar to what it was 150 years later with the polar vortex, with temperatures going down to as little as 2 degrees. And about a fifth or so of the men at any one time had no cover whatsoever on Belle Isle during that horrible winter. It's what happened when the prison population swelled. It was also the winter that it was as a result of the collapse of the exchange cartel that the prison camps that we all know in the debates over prison camps opened up. Those, of course, in Andersonville in February of 1864, Elmira here in June 1864, also closer to home, Danville, Virginia, Point Lookout, Maryland, Rock Island, Illinois, all these places, Millen, Georgia, where the Andersonville prisoners went after that. These all opened as a result of the swelling prison population into the tens of thousands in the winter of 1863, 1864. If we were to do a detailed study of conditions in these camps, which I'm not going to do today, it would entail other very important themes of Civil War history. Civil War medicine. Most of these men who died by the tens of thousands died of dysentery and diarrhea and other illnesses. And also of Civil War environmental history, which, as some of you know, is becoming a really booming field. Katie Myers' book about the self-care of men in prison, in conventional camps during the campaigns of 1862, 64, and Tim Silver and Judson Browning's forthcoming book on the environmental history of the Civil War. Prison camps are a huge part of the environmental history of the Civil War and of the treatment of wounded, treatment of diseased men, and of the distribution and the breakdown of the distribution system of supplies in the Confederacy, related very much to the issue of prison camps in the South. But instead of focusing on these, I'm going to focus on another aspect of Civil War studies, that of soldiering. We've seen lots of books, most of you are very familiar with these, and other books about Civil War soldiering. We've seen these from the days of veterans like Carlton McCarthy and John Billings, to the works of Bell Wiley and his student Bud Robertson, the late lamented Bud Robertson, and Gerald Linderman and Reed Mitchell, and studies of the soldiering in the Army of Northern Virginia and Army of Tennessee, to Jim McPherson's studies of why they fought, to Pete Carmichael's study of how they fought. The prison camps make an appearance in all of these, or most of these works, but I think we need to look a little more closely at how soldiers reconciled being a soldier with being a prisoner. From the perspective of the man who enlisted to serve in his country and fight for his cause, spending time in prison was antithetical. It was an anomaly. It was not why he signed up. And as a result of the prison cartel breakdown, more men ended up spending time in prison than ever dreamed it would be possible in the first 2 years of the war. Now, according to the best statistics, there were approximately 195,000 Union soldiers who became prisoners, and I know full well a lot of them became prisoners more than once, so there are fewer than 195,000 men, but 195,000 prisoners, of whom about 30,218 died, 15.5%, and about 215,000 Confederates became prisoners at one time or another, of whom 25,976, or roughly 12%, died. Joe Gladhar's study of the Army of Northern Virginia, the General Lee's Army, fabulous book if you've not read it, estimates that 16% of the Army of Northern Virginia became prisoners before Appomattox. There's prisoners being held at Belle Plaine in preparation for transfer to someplace or another. The famous prisoners at Gettysburg. And I guess it's just as well that Gary's not here because he doesn't have to hear me say this. As we all know, Gettysburg was the turning point of the war, right? No, Gary, the turning point was not the turning point. But historian David Silkenat has made the argument that, in his recent book, Raising the White Flag, he makes a cogent argument that Gettysburg was a kind of turning point. It marked the turning point in the experiences of surrendering soldiers. While most soldiers came into battle with the expectation that surrendered soldiers would be briefly imprisoned, paroled, and exchanged, this supposition, which undoubtedly played a role in soldiers' propensity to surrender, proved fundamentally and disastrously wrong. With the collapse of the Dix Hill Cartel, the thousands of soldiers who surrendered at Gettysburg, and then later at Chickamauga, found themselves in long-term detention in overcrowded prison camps with little expectation of release. Even after Gettysburg, anybody who studied Civil War prisons can tell you that men still hoped for and somehow expected release. They had what they called exchange on the brain, which was almost as important as food and rations in the daily obsessions for prisoners. As they continued to languish and to starve, how did the soldiers make sense of their experience? Were they still soldiers? Were they still serving their countries? Or were they simply passive victims of enemy cruelty? My research has been about Union soldiers in Belle Isle, so that's what I'm going to be talking about here a little bit. What I found is that the new realities of imprisonment, its duration, its condition, and its high mortality rates made imprisonment akin to active service in their perspective. Surviving prison is a noble fight, to paraphrase Billy Joel, in itself. Retaining one's patriotism and loyalty despite the temptation to take the oath in the interest of getting more food and better treatment fulfilled one's obedience to be a patriot and to stay with the colors despite the temptation. Soldiers read in newspapers about the negotiations to resume the cartel exchanges, and they knew the reasons for the failures. And some Confederates were happy that they weren't being exchanged because they would rather languish in prison than see African Americans treated as prisoners and as soldiers. Not the case for most federal prisoners. But whether they believed that the reason they were languishing was because the honorable thing of fighting for the rights of their African American soldier comrades, or that they were trying to starve out the Confederacy's manpower, prisoners believed that their suffering served a larger purpose. They were soldiers fighting on another front, in the front called prison camp. Henry Ladd, a Michigan, 24th Michigan soldier, wrote in his diary in September '64 from Belle Isle, "Our government refuses to parole us. The men think it hard." J. Osborne Coburn wrote in his diary on November 6, 1863 from Belle Isle, "When will the commissioners come to some terms as to our release, either by parole or exchange? However it serves to the interest of my country to remain, I'll try to be contented, but it is hard." Coburn did not survive the winter. Morgan Dowling, also of Michigan, wrote after the war, he survived, about the weapons that he faced in prison camp while his comrades still with the unit were facing guns and artillery. He faced the weapons of starvation and disease in serving on the prison camp front. And George Darby, who wrote Vermont, wrote an account after the war from which I'll read at some length that gets to the core of this issue. About the time of our capture by the enemy, General Grant, with the approval of Stanton and Lincoln, issued an order stopping the exchanges of all prisoner of war. The reason stated was that the healthy, fat, and well-fed rebel soldier, on being released, was immediately capable of active service in rebel ranks, while the starved, diseased, and dying Union soldier received in exchange for him had to be sent to the hospital either to die or to recover only after months of careful nursing and treatment. This heartless and cruel order consigns the thousands of brave defenders of the Union who had been captured in the forefront of battle to a lingering and ignominious death. And many of the Union prisoners after 1863 felt this way. This heartlessness and this cruelty that Darby talked about figures prominently in what is referred to in the literature now as the dark turn in Civil War historiography, which has become popular in the last 15 or so years. The dark turn focuses on guerrilla warfare, the mistreatment of civilians, and atrocities generally. And as I was reminded last night in reading a journal article, another recent historiographical trend, so-called neo-revisionism, also emphasizes that war was less virtuous, far more costly and harder than we usually acknowledge. Obviously, that describes the prisoner of war experience. Now, much of the literature about the dark turn focuses on the atrocities against African American soldiers at Fort Pillow, notably, in Tennessee in April of 1864, and also closer to home at the Battle of the Crater in July of 1864, the wanton murder of African American prisoners, or would-be prisoners, men trying to surrender in the battlefield. And this was not true just at these two battles, but also at Saltville, of course, Olustee, Poison Springs, and countless other actions in which Confederate soldiers raised the black flag against black men wearing blue uniforms. There were also well-documented cases in which both sides consciously violated the rules of war by placing each other's prisoners under fire. Friendly fire, or enemy fire, that is. In June 1864, in response to the Union bombardment of Charleston City, the city of Charleston, the Confederates placed 50 Union officers, transferred them from Macon to Charleston to, quote, share in the pleasures of the bombardment. U.S. officials then brought 50 Confederate prisoners from Fort Delaware and to Morris Island under bombardment, one of the bombardment points of Charleston Harbor, and eventually brought 600 men. The so-called Immortal 600 is a survivor badge, the Immortal 600 of the men who were under their guns of their own batteries at Morris Island in 1864. Eventually, both sides relented and returned their prisoners to their respective prison camps, and the original 50 men, in fact, were exchanged. Stories of the atrocities perpetrated against prisoners were the most consistent kind of propaganda throughout the Civil War and after the Civil War, as we'll talk about in a moment, on both sides. It intensified in 1864 with the publication of these photographs, usually represented today as prisoners from Andersonville, but David and I know better. They were prisoners released from Belle Isle after that horrible winter for humanitarian reasons to Annapolis, Maryland, and they were photographed and then appeared in this newspaper in June of 1864. When these images of human skeletons appeared, I have a few more, the familiar ones that we think of as Andersonville that aren't. These fueled a new propaganda literature and a report that appeared in newspaper articles about the suffering of the prisoners. This propaganda in which both sides learned to hate each other during the course of the war because of the accusations of atrocities on both sides. And it brought a report by the Sanitary Commission in 1864 with a 200-some page report filled with photographs and line drawings that we just saw, charging the Confederates with cruel and unusual treatment of their prisoners. And the Confederates, of course, responded later in March of 1865 with an official report that was pretty much a whitewash, and then in turn accused the Union of atrocities against their prisoners, arguing that the Union North could actually afford to do better, the argument with which we're all familiar. So that seed was planted by these reports and by this propaganda during the war itself. Something else here. And then, okay, I meant to put this a little bit later, but and it was the seed for the very first issues of the Southern Historical Society papers in 1876. I meant to do first. There you go. The extreme anger of the Northern public over Andersonville and the outrage led, of course, to the trial and execution, on the right, of Captain Henry Wirtz, the Swiss-born commandant of Andersonville, the only war crimes execution of the war. The proliferation of what became a virtual cottage industry of prison atrocity literature after the war, by the dozens, scores, and even hundreds of these pamphlets, self-published regimental histories, what happened to me at Andersonville, Belle Isle, Salisbury, Florence, etc., figures prominently in yet another theme in which prisons figure prominently. That is, of course, the study of Civil War memory, with which I think all of you are familiar. Historian David Blight, in the book Race and Reunion, said that throughout the 1860s and 70s, the persistent anger of Civil War prisons delayed the spirit of national reconciliation and obstructed the acceptance of an inclusive reunification. Kerry Janey of UVA, his book on the Civil War memory, remembering the Civil War, wrote, "It is no small wonder that the perceived inhumanity and atrocities committed against prisoners of war would prove to be one of the bitterest memories for years to come. For somebody who wanted to wave the bloody shirt in the years after the war, the best thing to do would be to scream Andersonville." This Southern Historical Society papers issue, which repeated a lot of what was in that 1865 report and then elaborated on it, was in response to a speech that James G. Blaine, the man from Maine, made on the floor of Congress in 1876, reminding people of Andersonville and Jeff Davis's culpability in it. It led directly to that. So it's books on the study of Civil War memory, specifically on the right, Ben Cloyd's book on memory of Civil War prisons, specifically Andersonville, has been very valuable literature. The outpouring of prison atrocity narratives continued for decades and frankly has never stopped. While many Southerners, not just heritage activists, are still sensitive to the implication of Southern guilt over Andersonville, the report of 1865 and in the Southern Historical Society papers of 76 are still in print. And there have been, in the 30 years that I've been at the museum, these kinds of books continue to appear, rebuttals and counterattacks against the charge of the South's culpability in Andersonville. Andersonville itself, of course, fell pretty quickly into public hands. The GAR and the Women's Relief Corps got hold of the property after the war. It became a pilgrimage point, a kind of site of consciousness, if you will, in the decades after the war, and then was given to the War Department in 1910. So it took another 65 years to create a park there, in large part because of Southern opposition. They did not want a park that was going to be rubbing the South's face in the supposed guilt of Andersonville. And what the U.S. government did was create this National Prisoner of War Museum on the site, which in a sense contextualizes Andersonville, much the same way we're talking about contextualizing monuments today. But at the same time, there was a countervailing tendency. Even though the prison narratives was at the center of this continued acrimony for decades to come, there was also what we know from the Gettysburg Reunion of 1913, a certain softening of attitudes toward the men who fought the war. Didn't they fight bravely? Even if they fought for a bad cause, didn't they fight bravely and fight honorably? And this was particularly true for men who died in prison camps. There was a certain safe zone for men who fought and died in prisons. And what this meant, get ahead of myself, get to this guy in a minute, was that in the North, there was a softening of attitudes toward the men who died in prison camps. And in 1895, a Chicago GAR post proposed a monument to Confederate dead in their city, which was raised, and there was a fraternal visit of Southern veterans to the North. And it led, in fact, to the creation of a commemorative landscape in the North of monuments of various kinds. This one at Elmira, this one in Johnson's Island, this one at Camp Chase in Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio. Confederate monuments in the North at Confederate cemeteries. You go back to this man, Joseph Foraker, a Union veteran and governor of Ohio and senator of Ohio, who proposed in 1904 a commission for the marking of Confederate graves, Confederate prisoners' graves, in northern cemeteries, and cared for in perpetuity by the federal government. So this kind of hands across the stone wall at Gettysburg had its equivalent in these gestures of goodwill and the erection of such things as the Confederate cemetery by Moses Ezekiel at the small Confederate section at Arlington National Cemetery. So that's how we get Confederate monuments in the North as a result of this sort of reconciliation and acceptance of Confederate dead in the North. In more recent years, of course, these have become controversial symbols. That these were monuments to Confederate dead who died in ignominy in prison camps no longer protected them from criticism or from vandalism. This is that same statue you saw earlier in Columbus, toppled from its arch and decapitated in 2017 after Charlottesville. So after decades of rancor and bitterness and hostility over the treatment of each other's prisoners, both sides reconciled, only to have a later generation, ours, decide that these men don't deserve respect after all. So all this wartime propaganda in the beginning, this continued sensitivity about what happened in Civil War prisons brings us to yet another theme on which I will conclude. A civil war fought between rival sections or factions of one nation that ends with the reunification of those sections on effectively equal terms almost inevitably leaves wounds and scars. Think about it. How could it not? When both sides are free to write their own histories of the war and to erect commemorative landscapes celebrating and vindicating their side of the war, it lays the groundwork for continued tension and conflict, unless, that is, both sides agree to at least tacitly tolerate the other's claims and distortions in the name of national unity and civic peace. Over time, this kind of tolerance smooths out the rough edges of the war, even if it does injustice to truth. In David Blight's insightful analysis, healing, however much we might want or need it, undermines justice. In his Race and Reunion, of course, in other books about Civil War memory, this theme usually applies to race and in the injustice that healing did to African American troops and African American memory. Americans are talking about this a lot today, of course, and about Civil War monuments in particular in the commemorative landscape. But it also relates to Civil War prisons. As a reunited country, we have needed to smooth out the rough edges of our Civil War. A nation that has fought to save civilization twice in Europe and in the Cold War cannot afford to continue fighting over Andersonville and Elmira. The horrible conditions of Civil War prisons are undeniable, and they're a blot on our national past. But let's not dwell on who was to blame. Rather than keeping the wounds open, Americans have chosen to acknowledge the horrors and avoid the questions of guilt and blame. Civil War historians have done this too. So James Randall and David Donald wrote, "The sickening story of Andersonville, however, is not to be set down in the manner of the lurid prison literature as a chapter in Confederate cruelty. It is the tragedy of an impossible situation forced by the barbarity of war. The history of prisons should not be read as a mandate for the perpetuation of sectional blame and censure." Jim McPherson, in his Battle Cry of Freedom, wrote, "Few, if any, historians would now contend that Confederates deliberately mistreated prisoners. Rather, they would concur with the contemporary opinions held by some Northerners as well as Southerners, that a deficiency of resources and the deterioration of Southern economy were mainly responsible for the sufferings of Union prisoners. The South could not feed its own soldiers and civilians. How could it feed the enemy prisoners? The Confederacy could not supply its own makeshift tents. How could it provide tents for captives? A certain makeshift quality in Southern prison administration, a lack of planning and efficiency also contributed to the plight of prisoners." Charles Sanders, his book I showed you earlier, begs to differ. He contends that much of the suffering that occurred in the prison camps, North and South, was not just accidental or the product of inefficient supply or uncontrollable disease. He documents instances in which prison officials deliberately reduced rations or denied rations and supplies in response to reports that the other side was doing the same thing. Both sides were guilty, according to Sanders, of sins of omission as well as commission. Both sides could have done better to avoid and ameliorate suffering, but they chose not to, according to Sanders. I think we all recognize the value and the virtue of national unity and not continually picking at scabs, but it is possible, and it should be possible, to find this balance between healing and something approaching truth. Now, even in our own sophisticated times, historians are still debating the fundamental question of how civil or uncivil was our Civil War. The dark turn school reminds us about atrocities or acts that we tend to want to ignore or bury. But other historians, Aaron Chiandine's book on Calculus of Violence, which won our 2018 Davis Prize, and David Silkenet's book on surrenders, which I mentioned earlier, don't deny the atrocities, especially those perpetrated against African Americans, but they remind us that the war could have been much worse, that there was restraint on both sides, and both sides tried at least to follow rules of war, such as recognizing exchange or taking prisoners at all, rather than simply murdering them, and exchanging them for at least part of the war. So this is a kind of an endemic debate. It's going to go on forever, like, what would have happened if Stonewall Jackson had lived? It's going to go on forever and provide assure jobs for Civil War historians for generations to come. Is how civil or uncivil was this war. But if you want to understand how the Civil War was at once both civil and uncivil, or if you want to understand pretty much anything else about the Civil War, I suggest you study Civil War prison camps. Thank you all very much for your attention.